Welcome to the Normal Public Library. This is Poetry is Normal presents Donna Vorreyer. Donna Vorreyer is our guest poet tonight in our guest poet series, which is supported by the Normal Public Library Foundation. Big thanks to the foundation. I'm Kathleen Kirk. I'm here with John Fisher, who's facilitating our Zoom room and our Facebook Live broadcast. So we'll remind you that if you find during the reading that you have any comments or questions for Donna Vorreyer as she reads, you can type them in there and we'll check with you later. Let me tell you a little bit about Donna. Donna Vorreyer is the author of To Everything There Is. Every love story is an apocalypse story, and A House of Many Windows, all from Sundress Publications. I happen to have A House of Many Windows right here. And I have some of the other books somewhere else in my house of many windows. And she's also written 8 chapbooks, and I have one of those at hand as well from Redbook Chapbooks. Her work has appeared in Baltimore Review, Tinderbox Poetry, Poet Lore, Sugar House Review, Waxwing, and many other journals. And she serves as an associate editor for Rhino Poetry. I used to work for Rhino as well, so we have that in common. Recently retired from 36 years in public education, she says she looks forward to new adventures, but as I understand, one of your new adventures was to return to school as a teacher in this time of need. So what we'll do is have Donna tell us everything she wants to tell us about herself and her poems, and read her poems to us. And we'll check in every now and then with any questions that we have during or at the end. So Donna Vorreyer, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kathleen, so much for asking me to be here this evening. Thank you to the library also for this wonderful program. And thanks to John for moderating and handling the technology. Yes, I did return to sub for the quarter as a long-term substitute at my old school. And it's been both delightful and exhausting after being at home for 8 months and retired. So just a few more weeks left to go, and then back to having time at home, which I think I will appreciate a lot more. Tonight is rare for a poet to be given 60 minutes to read or to talk about poems. So it was a little daunting at first to think about what I would do for an hour besides read poems to you, especially because my poems tend to be short. So I thought that I would like to maybe think about the two questions that people often ask poets when they first meet them or when they hear them at a reading. And one of those questions is, are these poems all about you? And the other question is, where do you get your ideas? And so I thought as I read some poems tonight, I would talk about a little bit about each of those questions, because some of the poems are autobiographical and clearly about experiences that I've had, and others are way out there in the realm of persona or mythology or somewhere else. So to talk a little bit about kind of the way those poems arrive. So I'm going to kind of go chronologically through some of my work. Kathleen held up A House of Many Windows, which was my first collection from Sundress. And as with many poets, first collection is often autobiographical. Because the first poems you write and tend to spend a lot of time on are ones that are about you. And this book chronicles kind of my struggles with infertility, and then eventually the adoption of my son. So it's a book that took, technically 17 to 25 years to write, which sounds ridiculous, but my son was 17 when it was published. So keep working is what I'm saying. It doesn't come quickly sometimes. So I'm going to read a couple poems from A House of Many Windows. The first poem I'll read is called Upon the Second Attempt, Whole Foods. Care for the container, and the fruit will not bruise, my grandmother would repeat. Her own picking basket smooth and neat, all stray points cut or sanded away. So we begin to wander, empty-handed, seeking to maintain the vessel, all organic, free of foreign substance, feathering a natural nest where a guest would want to settle, a nest woven to impress so that any fruit, having spent all summer ripening without a blemish to call its own, would wait for hands to cradle it instead of falling, hard and half-formed, from the branch into the yard. So the first section of this book, there's several failure poems after the second failure, third failure. And in each one, I tried to kind of pick some kind of mundane occurrence that would mimic some of the emotional impact of that failure. So this one is called After the Sixth Failure, IKEA. The dictionary has no word for undoing expectations, so we go shopping instead. We buy a headboard, cool and gray as a gravestone, move onto slick Swedish clocks, tissue-thin lampshades, bordered with linen, jewel-toned art, any bold or fragile thing to quell our desire for pastel. We pile the cart with parts to build a new fixation, try to fill a hole in a pail that holds no water. We follow signs on edges of tables, prepare our little wrenches, take everything we think we may need. And then later on, the third section of the book is about my son, and it's the shortest section of the book, and moves very, very quickly from infancy to him being a young man. And I've had people ask me like why that section isn't longer, and my response is always that because that's how it feels when you raise a child, especially when you've waited for a long time, right? Is you've waited and waited and waited, and finally, when we adopted him, he was 5 months old, but that time between infancy and him leaving to go to college just seemed like a blink compared to the time that we waited for him to arrive. And so this is just a poem from closer to the end of the book called Manhood. I hear it rattling in the slow burn of his bundled slumber, the chirp of his child's voice dipped to deep bass even in murmuring sleep. Exertion brushes him with a musky sheen, more stench than sweetness in his sweat, the smooth skin of his upper lip seeded with dark weeds. I cannot lift the ladder he carries across the yard, the soft body I cradled now hardened to muscle. I cannot keep him from all the mistakes a man will make. And so that first book was very close to me, very confessional, very autobiographical. And as Kathleen knows, as a writer, that's a beautiful thing to be able to shape those experiences, but it can also sometimes be quite exhausting to write from something that's very close to you. And so that first question people always ask is the poem about you. And my smart aleck answer usually is, well, I wrote it, so there's something of me in it. But that doesn't mean that it's about me. But I think there's some truth to that, because the speaker in a poem can take an emotion or an experience to an abstract or a metaphorical level to deepen it, that sometimes is much richer than what really happened, or the narrative of the actual experience that the poet might be talking about. So I think that one of the pleasures of being a poet is to be able to find a unique way to relate an experience, not just as it happened, but as it might resonate to others, and then in a way that the poem wants it to. And sometimes themes return to you. So I published the book in 2013, but really had been writing those poems for many, many years. And some of the newer work that I'm working on is more about aging, the aging body, about questions of faith, struggling with some questions of faith in the face of some losses. And I didn't think I would be writing, and that my issue of not being able to have children would come up anymore. in any kind of context, being now almost 60, that topic was done for me. But I am seeing it pop up. So I'm going to share a new poem now, where it kind of returns to that theme, but then pushes it forward into a new idea. So this is called Transubstantiation. 1. How I wanted to be a changed thing, my body refusing to obey. This blessed body, not as in consecrated, but as in irritated, as in there was not a blessed thing I could do to make a child. Stripped of its purpose, the body shifts, becomes a husk for shame or pleasure, sometimes both at the same time. Becomes a temple without an altar, an empty arc of midnight sky. 2. This is my body given for you. 3. How every blessed thing becomes othered. A feather blessed with ink becomes pen. A canvas with pigment becomes a world. Bread becomes a body, wine becomes blood, bodies inked and oiled to tell their stories. How one thing can always be another. How even a barren woman can be a mother. 4. This is my blood shed for you. 5. How the body changes in its decline. The cheeks sink to outline the skull, the eyes wide and wild. Robust muscles fade to frail. How the child can cradle the mother now, rock her in arms she bore. How the child can cradle the father now, soothe him with hands he kissed and held. How the priest blesses their foreheads while they can still speak. How morphine is placed on the tongue, the chalice a sponge of water pressed to unmoving lips. 6. The body on earth, a temple in ruins. It should never need to be forgiven. So, as hinted in that poem, I lost both of my parents in 2018 within 5 months of one another, and we were caretaking them for pretty much that whole year, both together, and then just my father, which is a whole new experience for people my age. My newest book, To Everything There Is, started being written in 2015, really as a book of love poems. And I was drawing language from Moby Dick, which is my favorite novel, which might seem like a strange place to draw language for love poems. And I really thought that I was on my way to having a manuscript that was, shaping up into something. And then when my parents got ill, I really wasn't writing anything. And then when my mother died, writing was a way for me to kind of deal with that grief. And as I went back, I realized that some of these poems about grief really worked in tandem with the poems about love, because you can't have one without the other. And so To Everything There Is completely changed form in terms of the way it was looking as a manuscript. And we've coined the word for it. We're calling it a celebrology, right? A book of elegy that also celebrates that great love that you have in order to grieve. You don't grieve things that you don't love. And so I'm going to share a few poems from that book. I'll share the first one I'll share is one of the poems that was initially one of the Moby Dick poems. And then I'll share a few others from the book. This one's called A Peculiar Emptiness, which is, the title is directly from Moby Dick. A black night, an open sky, the lake holding its breath. The oars slip their clip and sink beyond my reach. Left stranded, adrift, I am more buoy than boat. I wish you would leave my name out of your mouth. The humid air, the taunting stars, Orion sheathing his sword. My hands cup and paddle the still water toward shore. Back on the sand, I stumble and collapse, heaving sighs. I want to row away from all this ballast. Lying here, With all this tattered longing, I want to plug every gaping, slack-jawed hole inside of me. I tell you, I am fed up with this wanting.
Donna,
Sorry, I had these marked. Go ahead, please.
I have a question for you,
Yes.
maybe a comment too. I loved when you said that's how fast it feels, about how quickly your son grew up. And I had recently reread the play Our Town, and Emily comes back, just relive a day of her life, and that's her whole sensation. It goes by so fast, and we don't have time to look at each other. I was wondering if some of that feeling also happened to you during the writing of these grief poems, during the time that you were caring for your parents. Did that seem to have gone by quickly too, or did everything
I think
slow down?
It was more the opposite. Yeah, I think everything seemed to slow down, like, because every day had such weight to it. Whether that was the weight of knowing that there wasn't a lot of time left, or the weight of what do we do? Is this the right thing to do? You know, there's so many decisions that get made when you're caretaking, and wanting to respect their wishes and yet still, you know, do what we thought we knew was the best for them. So I would say slow. That went very slowly. It seemed like the longest year of my life. But it's one that I wouldn't change because I was able to be there, and not everybody is. So
thank you for sharing that.
Oh, that's okay. Time works in funny ways, you know, and that's one of them, I think. It knows when you need it more. So I'm going to read another one of the Moby Dick poems because that one won't make me cry again. So one that's one of the love poems. And the title and the last line of the poem both come directly from the novel. And this is called Not the Least Among the Strange Things. The way you cup my face as though receiving alms. Ignore my continual quiver of worry, the peculiar perils of it. Steel your bones against our inclement age. Like tug captains, we tow the old burdens around the world. You at the wheel, my eyes on the horizon, blending our thoughts with the cadence of the waves. Each day we oil the hinges of our jaws, fill a closet with days and years already past. Each creak of our paltry joints, a half-throttled shriek. But skin still seeks skin, and when we cannot sleep, we slip out onto the silent deck, and like the old astronomers, look up and sing out for new stars. I will share one of the, after we lost both parents, one of the things that was really difficult was kind of everywhere you went, the weirdest things would remind you of them or of the situation you had just been in. And as Kathleen mentioned before, I was a middle school teacher for many, many years, and one of the field trips we used to take with students was to the Field Museum in Chicago. And one wouldn't think that anything at the Field Museum would would trigger memories or a grief poem, but that is just how that seemed to happen. So this is called After Observing the Mummy with My Students at the Museum. One says that his skin glows. Another that he looks peaceful. Amber-hued and desiccated, he seems to me indifferent, his narrative resolved. He lies surrounded by scarabs, their brilliance auspicious, more to my liking, the way their jeweled green and lapis backs hint at reed and river, the earth that tethered him, the sky that his gods occupied. We move on through the mammals, and I think it is no phenomenon to ritualize death. The wake for my own father just weeks ago, a somber sort of party, adorned with photographs and flowers, until grief stomped in like a wayward moose, terrifying in its stature, but wielding tenderness in its great eyes. We arrive at the dinosaur remains, the reconstructed bones majestic, scaffolded with bolt and steel. We learn to tell carnivore from herbivore by the teeth, which bones lingered in pits of tar, how the creatures thrived but could not abide change. One student asks the docent about the size of their hearts, and I don't hear the answer, as my own beats loud and primordial, my body performing in hypothalamic motion, caring for, then burying both parents within 5 months, their lives too entwined to survive, one without the other. There was a holiness to their faces in their last days, a gaunt and drawn, yet knowing look, much like the mummy. I wander back to study his face. Peaceful is right, I decide. The deliberate fold of his hands across his chest, the scarabs shimmering, singing, remembered, remembered. And so, like I said, our poem is about you. Lots of times they are, right? But there are lots of times where very strange and odd things can inspire poems. And I'm going to hopefully share some of those with you now, and then we'll go back maybe to some newer poems at the end. So Kathleen earlier held up this little chapbook, which is called The Imagined Life of the Pioneer Wife. I have no particular fascination with pioneers or that era of history, but I was writing and some imagery came to me that seemed to be something a modern person wouldn't focus on or say, and started to think about who might say something like this. And I created this character of this pioneer wife, this woman who was taken out to the wilderness to start this new life. And it started with one poem, and then I kind of got obsessed with the pioneer wife. Like, what else would she do? She'd probably have to learn to make soap. She'd have to learn to plant plants. She'd have to maybe have medical difficulties that, without things that you needed. She'd maybe have folk remedies. And I kind of started to take this deep, deep dive into who this woman might be. And I think when you're writing in persona, it gives you permission to kind of live this other life that is not yours, but still feel the things this person might feel, which I thought was a really fun thing to do. And I know Kathleen has done that as well with persona. So I'm just going to read a couple poems from this chapbook and then talk a little bit about how other obsessions can kind of lead to things. So this was the first poem in this series that kind of started me on wondering what the rest of this woman's life was like. And this is called The Pioneer Wife Writes Her Sister Back East. I watch the sun paint patterns, some shifting, long, while others shadow thin and fast, strands drawn across dark underbrush. Who would guess, alone with my need, with all this longing, that I would love this place, this brutal fist of wilderness? I am different now, aged and brittle from labor. My boots stomp through fragile crust to settle into what is solid and true. The Reverend says that God moves us in directions we never meant to go because he sets our compasses toward heaven. What a narrow aperture between fate and faith, between the locked door and the open gate. Some chasms echoing deep regret, some ringing wild and glowing like cathedral aisles full of fire. Part of the research that I got really into were what were some like folk remedies that people on the plains used. And that also became a poem, which was really fun to write, called "Upon the Occasion of Her Daughter's Nuptials, the Pioneer Wife Creates Lists of Lesser-Known Remedies. To avoid quarrels, fill your mouth with liquid and swish for 1 minute when your spouse begins to scold. Hit a stutterer in the mouth with a chicken gizzard. Sear an animal bite with a hot iron to avoid rabies. Strike a match, blow it out, then place the burnt end on a wart. Send someone else to hide the match. For a headache, sleep with scissors beneath your pillow. For chills, sign the cross on your back with a new broom. For monthly cramps, cut a lock of hair from behind your right ear in the moonlight. Throw it over your right shoulder. Pierce your ears with a needle if your eyesight is poor. Drink the juice of baked onions for a cough. Put sulfur in your shoes to ward off flu. A potato in your pocket will absorb arthritis, harden, not rot. For warts, steal bacon from a neighbor and rub the skin. Turn a convulsing child on his left side, never right. If your man turns to drink, feed him oranges 5 times a day, then 4, then 3, until the smell of alcohol sickens him. For nosebleed, tie 9 knots in a string. A leather thong around the waist for the appendix, then around a tree. Observe your husband, your children in sleep. Treasure the calm on their faces, the serenity. Resolve to touch them fondly at least once a day. Remind yourself that you are a woman, even here, so far from what is tender. So most of those are real remedies that I found. A few of them I made up, but most of them are real. I think the real ones are weirder than the ones I made up, so that was a lot of fun. My second collection, which is called Every Love Story is an Apocalypse Story, actually started with me being obsessed with the journals of Lewis and Clark, of all things. And I was reading the journals, and I was really fascinated by the way they spoke about the wilderness, both the beauty and the terror of the wilderness. The language was so intimate and formal in a way, so really kind of flowery. And I thought, what an interesting type of language to use. Then it was kind of ripe to explore maybe a wild and maybe decaying relationship. So people, like, this is funny about this book is that, it's about a relationship that goes very badly, and then maybe resurrects itself at the end. And this book is not autobiographical, but because it's about a relationship, people always assume it is. And I've had lots of readers read it in different ways. I've had people come up and tell me they think it's a book about mental illness. They think it's a book about divorce. They thought it was a book of elegy, which I find fascinating, right? When people bring something to what you wrote in a completely new context from how or why you wrote it. So once again, I started with the language of somebody else, pulling, some beautiful phrases and words and kind of moods, I guess, kind of a mood board, so to speak, of language, from a very unpoetic thing, these historical journals. And as I started writing poems, realized that just focusing on only that kind of natural arc would probably be boring to read over the course of a lot of poems. And then I kind of got interested in figuring out, well, what would happen if this relationship completely ended and one person kind of really went off their rails. And so it became more almost like writing a story, right? I had to kind of fill in an arc of events, which was really fun to do. So I'm going to share a few poems from that book. The first two are two of the ones that started with journals of Lewis and Clark. The titles are actually sentences from the journals. So this one is, we set sail under a gentle breeze. Suddenly the wind turns. A sky that has been dark dims to white. We run to shore, discover a skiff with oars bent outward like welcoming arms. Tadpoles skitter beneath the bow as we balance our weight, then push off. Loose-limbed, we row with an easy current, dip into ripples, our day long, the hours unticked by clocks. Recall the sermons about sloth. This is how ruin begins. Little hint of ominous in the relationship there. Let's see. I did mark these. This one is called Salvage. This one has some of the items that were listed in an inventory in the journals are included in this poem. We pick through the rubble under the pier. A tangled net, a tow line, an amber bottle half buried in silt and seaweed. All can be of use. The line to pull clear of quicksand, the net for trapping minnows, the glass as tool or weapon. You present a bouquet of reeds gathered with a bow of old balloons. Flourish it with a grin. In these circumstances, it will suffice. Your eyes a mansion, this raft a ferry. Some small god dances at the window, ticking off all our sins. And there is a point in the book, like I said, where the speaker kind of descends into this spiral of loss, kind of wild loss. And so there is a poem called Feral that I'll share, and then I'll move on to something else. This one's called Feral. Set fire to the chairs and run to the woods, to the secret hill where the ground is littered with the black wings of crows. Drape the fabric of your cloak loose enough to let winter season your blood. After a day, leave it over a stone. Let lights on a porch become a memory. See your sister's head for an instant at the window and think only food. Circle the wooded world as visitor, never leaving a trace, but be wary. There will be shots as you prowl near a house, days when your stomach is an empty pocket, your tongue hungry for the slightest scrap or drip of milk. But do not return. They will fear your four-legged crawl, your wild grumbling that sounds just faintly like a human name. And I think when we talk about, where do you get your ideas? Sometimes they just come from the strangest places. My husband and I travel a lot, and I usually keep a journal when we travel. And I don't always go back to them. I probably should. But we were actually watching, we love to watch Michael Palin travel documentaries. I think he's brilliant at really getting to know a place. And he was doing a series in the Amazon, which we had visited. And he was speaking to somebody about the myths of the pink dolphins. And I turned to my husband and I said, wait, I remember when we were there, someone telling me the myths, but I can't remember what they are. And so then there's the research comes again, right? And the myth is actually that these dolphins, which they call the boto, will sometimes at night shape-shift into men who then come ashore and seduce the women. And I just kind of got obsessed with that idea of what would happen, if there was like a love story. It was supposed to be kind of forbidden, to manage, or to be near these creatures. And supposedly they lived in this underwater land called the Encante, and they would steal you away if you got too close to the water. And I kind of just, again, deep dive into this mythology, but I really wanted to write a kind of a love story between a girl and one of these shape-shifting fish. I have a friend who calls it my sexy dolphin book. But So I started kind of writing the couple of poems, and I decided this girl would be an unhappy girl, and this is why she was ending up by the river every night watching the dolphins, and ended up with this love story. And I think my favorite thing about these poems also, though, is that I have a favorite artist named Matt Kish, and some people might be familiar with him because he did a project several years ago where he illustrated every page of Moby Dick. And I know the book of those paintings has been published by Tin House, and he's very active on Instagram sharing his work. And I wrote him and said, I have all these really weird, like, shapeshifter dolphin poems. I would be so honored if you would consider, like, maybe doing something for the cover. And so not only did he do that, he ended up doing 10 original pieces of art for the poems. And Redbird Chapbooks, which is based in Minnesota, was really excited about the idea of having, like, a full color chapbook. So we got really lucky. This is the beautiful cover, and I'll read like two of the poems that are more like the love poems, and this is the girl and the dolphin on the floor. So the first poem is called First Sight. Tonight the stars are slurry, floating on the river, a familiar darkness, hypnotic lapping of current against canoes. No change, the same bright curves against the distance. But then a sudden churning, shadows passing beneath shadows, a streak of pink like a sunrise in the water. I rest my hand on the surface until the fish rises, grazes my skin to tremble, my palms tracing the arc of its movement, its thick muscle, its fins. The head emerges, one shining black eye staring directly into mine, the snout closed to hide its teeth so as not to frighten me. A minute or an hour? How long we stared until it slid back deeper, further, and disappeared. That night I slept the sweetest sleep, dreamt of drowning. That's the girl's perspective. And then we have the dolphin's perspective in ashore. She waits in the rill, my riverine girl, and water cannot hold me. Tonight I am alluvial, powering past her outstretched arms onto the bank where my gills close and I grow legs. Eyes that stare from a human face, skin a thing I never knew I wanted. How can one want a thing until he's felt it, worn it, lived a moment inside of it? She scans the water for ombre waves of pink, but turns to offer her hands to me, flat and welcoming. I glide my head across her palms until her fingers clutch my hair as she explores my eyes, a darkness she recognizes. Then she swims into me, all lips and sway, all hips and honey and skin, and skin, and skin. So that was, I loved writing these poems because they were completely fantastical, but then to have Matt illustrate them was just such a dream come true. And I have actually all of the original art that he did for it. I have a lot of it hanging in my office. So very often I think, people say, where do you get your ideas? For me, it's from something I'm reading, something I'm watching, experience traveling. I haven't written a lot of travel poems, I think, because I always feel like I'll never capture the place well enough to do so. But having the myth was an excuse to kind of take advantage of that. But very often it's through language or through rediscovering something I used to love, maybe when I was younger, and looking at it in a new light. And that's what happened with, I have a chapbook from Dancing Girl Press called Tinder, Smolder, Bones, and Snow. And I had found, it was I think my grandmother's copy of Andersen's fairy tales, like a 1914 beat up copy of Andersen's. And the language was so just weird and strange, and words we don't use anymore, and very formal. But I think I was struck by this, even in the simplest of stories that weren't about a girl, there was always some like pretty girl who lived in a big house, who somehow, had to be pleased in some way in the tale, whether it was, through something a boy did, or a flower, or an animal, or whatever the case may be. And I then, of course, started to like, well, what would happen if we took this, pretty girl in all these fairy tales and put her in a world that was truly like apocalyptic, kind of like post-war apocalyptic. Not that I have anything against pretty girls, but I just thought it would be fun to put her in a situation to see if she could handle it. So that's where really these poems came from. I started with word banks from the old Andersons. So there are a lot of vocabulary in this chapbook that would be things we normally use now. And again, it was really fun to see if I could kind of craft the narrative using the language from these old tales that everybody knows, but kind of making them unrecognizable. So I'll just read a couple of those. The first poem is called The Hag Advises the Pretty Girl. This knowledge exists as much in the leaf as in the blood. Good is hidden in the form of a rat or a mushroom, as often as a feathery coronal or the fresh twigs of a flower. You don't know the world as well as I do. You still want pomp and parade, while a stork's nest decorates my chimney. My pot is filled with poor, despised herbs, steeped and roasted and broken. You say you cannot eat alone. You ask how I can bear a bed of straw and isolation. But I shall get my kisses. A dram and a bit of bread will be my feast, while you huddle lonely, awaiting your prince. I will tend lovers by a fire. So many red sparks among the ashes, mounting the chimney straight up to the sun. And then so the pretty girl loses her husband and family in this war and ends up on her own. And there are, as she's on her journey, these bodies that are encountered on the road. The first is the husband, whom she has to bury. And the second is a soldier who she steals supplies from. And then the third is kind of stolen a little bit from the idea of the little match girl. So this one's called Body Immolated. Little naked feet, skin transparent as veils. Did you count the matches remaining, rare as stars? Did you cry out as the wind whistled them to flare to a long plume of fire? Did you sputter as your soul mounted up, your body another pile of ash? Little girl who wanted only to be warm, there will be no urn, keep you. So it was kind of just a way to take an old character and put the character in a new situation. And then I think the last kind of idea thing that I'll talk about is, again, vocabulary related. It seems to be what happens with a lot of my work. And I was teaching kind of an advanced language arts class at the time, and every time we would get new vocabulary words, my complaint would be, no one ever says these words. No one ever uses these words. These words are never in a book. These words are never in a poem. Like, why do you make us use these words? And I said, well, they are words. People use them. And they're like, well, nobody uses them to write about kids our age or kids. They're all like grown-up words. And so I created this character who I just called the girl. And I started writing these little prose block poems that were all titled with one of the vocabulary words as a way to get started. So I'm just going to read a couple of those. Those ended up actually as a little chapbook from Pork Belly, which is called The Girl, simply. They make beautiful books. So this was the first one that came from their whining, called Duplicitous. On the playground, the girl pumps her legs to push the swing higher, not to reach the sky, but to kick the shaggy-haired boy in the back of his head with an errant flip of her right high top. She hates him. Well, not hates, but he ignores her at lunch, laughs at her in science class, looks the other way when she passes in the hall. Just as she acquires the proper height, he turns and smiles with one side of his mouth. The girl pulls back her foot, twists the swing to slow momentum, the soft flesh between her thumb and forefinger pinched in the chain. She curses, and the skin calls forth a blood blister, angry and purple. He walks over, reaches for her hand, and she offers the wound. She blushes at the first touch of his fingers against the raised dot. Later that night, in the dark, she will suck the spot until it wrinkles, taste his apology, her own deception, copper in her mouth. And the kids being like, woo, that's kind of a kissing poem. I'm like, not really. And I'll just read this one as well, just simply because one of the lines in this poem also came from a very strange place, which was, I followed some musicians on Twitter, not a lot, but a few. And my son's favorite band is Blink-182. And so over the years, I've gotten to really enjoy them as well, simply because I listen to them so much. And I follow Mark Hoppus, who's one of the members of the band. And he tweeted some ridiculous thing one day about having no groceries in the house. And he's like, I really want to eat lunch, but I'm calculating the half-life of this ham, was the silly tweet that he wrote. And I misread ham as harm. And then I thought that was a really interesting idea. So the girl in this poem is scientific. The girl posits theorems, dissects her vegetables. She whispers apologies to the dust motes on her lashes when applying mascara. She recites the periodic table in the shower. She can make a potato clock, but she prefers digital. She collects dirt from wherever she travels, labels latitudes and longitudes from memory. She's concocting a cure for shyness in her bedroom, using mice and Guinness and Daft Punk songs. When her heart gets broken, she knows this term is inaccurate. Instead, she transcribes each moment, translates it to numerals, calculates the half-life of each harm. So I think that if there's any lesson to be learned, it's really that poems can come from anywhere, from pop culture to research, weird facts you've seen on the internet, a book you're reading, anything that really strikes your fancy. So I have a couple of newer poems I'm going to plan on ending with, but I was just wondering if there were any questions that I could answer.
We'll have John take a look at Facebook for comments or questions related to what you've been telling us. I'm kind of thrilled that a lot of your poems came from your students whining, I think you said, complaining about vocabulary. Did you read a lot of the poems to your students to let them know, or were they?
Actually, that was one of my favorite little book launches ever, because instead of me reading them, we had an event where 5 or 6 of the girls that had been in that class came and all chose their favorite one, and they did the reading. So yeah, I don't share all of my work with my students, especially that I kind of moved down to 6th grade and it's a little over their heads, most of it. But I do stay in contact with a lot of students as they get older, and have had, I actually had a couple of students who were in my 8th grade classes years ago, who are probably now in their late 30s, show up at my book launch for To Everything There Is a few months ago. That's another one of the pleasures of Zoom, right? So yeah, it's been, and I know that one of my former students is now the poetry editor at Salt Hill Journal, and a poet in her own right, which is very exciting. So yeah, that connection to students is one that I'll always have, even if I'm not teaching. So it's really fun to think about.
Yeah, that's really thrilling. And you've used the words persona and speaker, And I wonder, for some of our people who are listening and watching that might not be familiar, would you explain a little the difference, define persona and explain the difference between a persona and speaker, a more general term?
Absolutely. Very often, to avoid immediately conflating the author with the person speaking in the poem, because very often poems are in first person, it's become common to refer to whoever is narrating the poem as the speaker, even if that poem seems like it is autobiographical or confessional in some way. Speaker is a general term for the narrator of the poem. When we talk about persona, we're specifically taking on the life of another person who is definitely not yourself. So, like, I am not a shape-shifting dolphin, or a girl who falls in love with one, or I am not a girl who kicks boys in the head with a swing, although I probably have done that in my life, to be fair. I am not a woman dealing with the difficulties of, the pioneer world. So those are very clearly persona poems. And, some poets are masterful at writing in persona. Patricia Smith's book, Blood Dazzler, where she writes as Hurricane Katrina, is, probably one of the best modern examples of that. And writing in persona is really fun, because you get to really do whatever you want. Or if you're writing about a real person, which you have done in persona, then that becomes a research project as well, to make sure that you are not only getting the details right, but doing that person justice. So I think both of those are, and you can have a speaker in a poem that is not a different person, that's just an I, that isn't necessarily you either. So it can be very confusing if you don't read a lot of poetry to automatically, that's why people always ask that question, is this poem about you? Which is valid, I think. The more you read, I think the more you realize that poets write from a lot of other perspectives other than just their own.
Yeah, thank you. And it's been thrilling to hear this array of your work over time and hear so much about where it comes from, and thrilling to hear about the research. There's a lot of information and myth, as you pointed out, a wonderful blend of curiosity and imagination, curiosity about the real and the ability to make stuff up. I want to check in with John and see if he has any questions for you from Facebook.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Donna. No questions on Facebook yet. Lots of support, lots of positive comments and love coming through on Facebook.
Oh, that's nice to hear. I thought then I would just end with two